All right. Hey, please welcome to the show, Blake Robin, Luxury.
Hello, Will, and people listening. Hello.
Hey, man. Thanks for talking to me. I
Hello.
really appreciate it. Uh, I like what I've learned about your background. I myself have had different experiences before I sort of landed at what I'm doing lately. I wrote for music for theater many years ago. I'm an attorney, and now I do a pop culture podcast. I love these stories where it's just kind of journey. It's a real journey, and then finally, it seems like something happens that you find yourself. What was your journey to find music? I suppose.
The journey to, I guess, this moment, piano lessons age 5, added
Mm-hmm.
some drums later on, started to be in, high school jazz bands kind of stuff. You sort of accumulate over time skills for the musicianship side of it. So
I see.
at a certain point, I got a guitar because having a drum kit was too much in a New York apartment, got a 4-track recorder, got a bass, again, accumulation over time. Um, that's happening on the musicianship front. And in parallel to all that is just being a lover of music, being a fan,
Yeah.
being someone who buys records, sits down, stares at the liner notes while listening. Between that, by the way, and actual, radio back announcing and MTV, where you've got visuals, I think a big part of why there's maybe a generation gap in music knowledge is
Yeah.
that we just grew up surrounded by information about it in parallel with the music happening. Now, of course, you can do a deep dive on Wikipedia and learn
Right.
whatever you want, but it's not really the same as when you're absorbed in the liner notes and you're starting to see names like, okay, Giorgio Moroder, producer. What does that mean? Keith Forsey on
Right.
drums. Oh, Keith Forsey is also on this Billy Idol record. And you start
Right.
to make these connections. Um, so all of that kind of leads to this moment where I've been a published musician. I came to LA with a publishing deal, so I would co-write for other artists. In parallel, I'm doing my own artist project, which is Luxury with 2 X's, where I make disco music and I write my own songs and sing them. I'm doing remixes and edits. All that's kind of in the stew. And then when the pandemic hit, one thing I left out was there was a chapter where I'd been collecting multi-track stems, which are the isolated
Mm-hmm.
instrumental and a cappella parts of famous songs. And I'd been given them. There's this sort of underground network of traders, and one of
I was
them is a friend of
wondering
mine.
about this.
Yeah, I know.
They're
It's
so
kind of,
clean. What you have is so
I know.
clean.
They're not done by AI. They're not DIY. They're just the
Yeah.
real deal. Like there's some engineer in the bowels of capital, like was dubbing copies, and it's like I'm gonna take some of these for myself and give them to my friends, and that's sort of fostered what this underground black market of which I am not technically for legal reasons a part, but I do reap the fruits of. So I had these, and I decided to actually, speaking of 80s,
Yeah.
remixing begins to a degree in the late 70s, early 80s with extending the music.
Oh yeah.
It starts with the song exists, and we're not really adding or subtracting, we're just elongating. So we're
Mm-hmm.
taking sections that previously had layers of synths and vocals, and we're stripping it down to the beats and the bass. And then you sort of add in the keyboards, etc. And your 3-minute song is 7 minutes long.
Right.
We've come a long way from that era, but when I first got the stems, I was like, I kind of want to go back to that. I want to make some remixes that aren't replacing the music
Mm-hmm.
using the acapella, because modern remixing tends to be that it's just the vocal and you've
Right.
replaced all the music with something else. You've replaced it with a harder hitting beat or a genre specific beat. So that's what I started to do. And I did that with this Don Henley song, with this Eagles song. And for legal reasons, I didn't say either of those words. A song by a band that's
A,
represented by a type of bird.
yeah.
Um,
A bird
and when I
centric
did
band.
I did that, and I put this remix out in the world in sort of the underground sort of disco edit scene, which is a small group of people who are mainly DJing songs of that era, but sort of yacht rock and boogie and funk and sort of more left of center selections. When I took this very mainstream song and put a vocoder to replace the voice and stretched it out so it was slower, it really kind of captured the attention of a few pretty prominent DJs in that scene who blew me up and caused me to be found by the record label. And long story short, I got a cease and desist, and my new career as a DJ exploded. Suddenly, I was want it
Yeah.
in both ways,
So yeah,
both
literally and figuratively.
both
Yeah.
senses of the term. So I'm apologizing that this long story short has failed to
No,
be
no.
short, but I only bring that chunk into it about the stems and the remixing of
Yeah.
using the stems, the multi-track isolated parts. Because fast forward to pandemic times, I'm on the couch like everyone, scrolling TikTok, thinking about my life, thinking about what comes next, thinking I really have been wanting to talk about and share these stems for quite some time.
Right.
Like it's really wonderful thing to be able to isolate, to just listen to the acapella from Under Pressure, and like you get chills up your spine when you hear
Hmm.
Freddie Mercury and David Bowie and you sense them looking at each other because in the isolated vocal, it's just you listening to them in a room 40 years ago.
Right.
So I really wanted to share that. And I started to make these videos. I did a video about Britney Spears Toxic, and I did one about Prince Let's Go Crazy. And they that started it actually overnight, literally became a huge thing. I went from 0 to 50,000 followers in a weekend on TikTok. And that's where we are now, where I've just been like enjoying continuing to tell those stories while I'm still making music, while I'm
Right.
still, doing both.
With regard to the remixes, you point out the Britney Spears one with "Toxic," where you find the samples from this Bollywood film, that are used. How do you go about designating what you choose to talk about, and then ultimately also find the source material? I mean, certainly talking about in the '80s,
Yeah.
this was just again word of mouth kind of stuff. But now we have other resources to do that. But a lot of these still are not something you would necessarily find on the internet, I think.
Well, it's a lot of one step in front of and then the next step, one foot in front of the other, because I don't necessarily go into it knowing where it's going to go. The exploration begins with I had the stems for toxic, so that's an easy beginning. And from there, I started to, by listening and cross referencing with available resources like AllMusic and Wikipedia and liner notes from albums, just
Mm,
that kind of messy process of research, essentially
right,
it's unpredictable. You delve into it going, well, I think I just want to talk about this song, but I do not know where I'm going with it. That
right.
turned into the discoveries that I made about who the players were, who what they did, aside from being Swedish session musicians. They also had lives outside of the pop scene where one of them, I thought it was two of them and I had to make a correction later, but that's its own sub story we can talk about.
Mm.
There's a metal connection, a black metal connection, not
Okay.
shocking given that it's Sweden, and if you're a
Mhm.
musician in Sweden you're probably doing ABBA like pop or you're doing metal, but guess what, you're doing both. Sometimes you're doing
The
both.
best stuff.
um, so in the case of that video, but actually in the case of all 150, 160 that I've done by now, they all kind of start with I have the stems and I like the song is kind of the starting point, and then I just start to research, and that's
Mm.
usually a 5 hour, 6 hour process. It's never less than that. I'm going through each
Wow.
stem, I'm
Mm.
listening, I'm thinking, what does this remind me of? I'm kind of deconstructing it with my musician brain. I'm like, okay, well, that's a four chord and a six chord. So all of
Right.
this stuff is incredibly messy. And the outcome is wonderfully surprising to me half the time. Like, I
Yeah.
won't have known going into it that the kind of linchpin of the story, the first 3 seconds that becomes the hook, was this thing that took me 4 hours of looking into it before I
Right.
found it.
It is pretty fascinating how, like you say, you don't know what you're getting into when you get into these, but you follow just sort of what your interests are.
Right.
That in most of your, I don't know, what, 30-second, 45-second, minute documentaries, there
Right.
is a narrative often where, I mean, literally they loop back around for, probably, whatever for counts, but there is this kind of arc and, sort of flow to it. It's that you're able to accomplish in such a short time.
I think part of what's emerged as I've started to do the videos, and it happened pretty quickly, was well, thank you for that, by the way, because that is thank you. It's a compliment. The fact that it seems like a comprehensive, self-contained story, if I may
Yeah.
paraphrase what I think you said,
Yes.
that's a product of a lot of effort. So I'm hopeful it comes across that way. Um, I would say that one cool thing that's emerged from doing a bunch that has become its own sub narrative is the thieving of work from people with less power, and how the process
Hmm.
of how the music industry and how creativity at large often is the product of the larger thing, the more powerful entity is often able to take the idea and have it be known to more people,
Yeah.
not as a result of it being their original idea, but
Right.
as a result of them taking what existed before and repackaging it in a new way, which, and by the way, that's not a judgment. I think that can be wonderful. And I actually, my thesis that's on, in the process of being developed about all of this about creativity is that we really overvalue originality.
Mm,
It's really hard to find the first version of any one thing.
sure.
What to me is creative is when things that potentially have previously existed in other forms, other songs, other works, are newly pieced together uniquely through the voice of the artist. And there's some special sauce on top that's hard to like articulate as a
Right.
general thing, but that's the creative spark. That's the uniqueness that gives it value, I'd say. So that tends the through line though, I would say, of all of these videos is that there is a sub narrative about power and about people with power, sometimes quashing the people without the power.
Sure. Now, I'm sure the not irony is not the right word, but the
Mm.
folks will be what immediately jumps to mind is, hey, wait a second, this guy's talking about exactly what he did, isn't he?
I think my interest in the topic comes from a belief that all creativity comes from something else.
Mhm.
And it's a not universally distributed system of like literally the legalities of it. The rules are not evenly distributed.
Right.
An easy example of that, and I've got a lot of them, is
Mhm.
cover versions are nearly effortless to create and to
Yes.
produce because all you need to do is pay for the compulsory mechanical license,
Right.
and you don't need permission. And there is a cost structure which is predictable, and there's even a structure in place to have the compensation take place with Harry Fox and everything. So if you wanted to cover a song, if you wanted to take an entire song
Mhm.
and cover it, you're allowed to do that legally, and it's really easy. You do give up 100% of the publishing. Your money is only going to come from the recording side of it,
Sure.
but that's clear and simple. Once you start getting into pieces of a song, whether it's because of an interpolation, which would just be the re-recorded version of a melody, or a sample, which is where you take the recording and you use that in your song, that's when things go out the window and become, I think, potentially prohibitively complicated and expensive. And that's where the power thing I just mentioned comes into play. I've
Right.
just been reading about Alan Klein. um, as a lawyer. You said you're a lawyer. You've been
Yes.
in law. I
Yeah.
mean, Alan Klein's one of those people in history that people know about, even though he was like behind the scenes as a publisher, and because he's been correctly maligned as the villain, including in the Get Back documentary.
Mm.
He's correctly maligned as the villain in the Verve being ripped off by the Stones story, which people seem to know about. Um, he was the head of a publishing company, long story short, that got the rights to the Rolling Stones catalog, the Beatles catalog, and ends up squeezing every penny from it, um, to the degree that the people he was essentially working for, these artists, the Stones and the Beatles, wanted out themselves. They were like,
Right.
dude, chill, bro. Um, that's right. And you correctly point out that I have myself infringed on copyright law. To what end? Well, it wasn't for financial gain. It
Mhm.
was in my worldview about how this ought to work. I think you've got in hip hop, you've got mixtapes. I think in dance music culture, you have white labels. You have these traditions where it's understood that the work is going to be other people's work is going to be reused, but it is not
Right.
necessarily for financial gain all the time. It's for exposure. It's to have a unique piece of work that you, as the DJ, have a version of a song, your own remix that nobody else
Right.
has. So it brings, this is, by the way, a big Jamaican thing. That's a huge part of Jamaican
Mm.
culture and Jamaican music history, is the unique, it's actually the origin of remixing itself, is
Right.
literally, if you had the King Tubby remix at Cox and Dodd's downbeat sound system and nobody else had it, you're going to Cox and Dodd's sound system,
Right.
and screw you, do greed. So this is, to me, a very essential part of the creative process in music, is being allowed to access and reuse existing ideas. And the question mark comes in this huge gray area about, well, what about monetizing it? What about rights? What about permission? That's a fair question. It's a fair question, and the complexity of that is beyond the scope of this sentence.
Well, well, you remind me. I spoke to Professor KJ Green, who's a professor out there in LA, well-regarded guy. He was once the attorney for Public Enemy, and we talked about this issue similarly because it is fascinating, like you pointed out, to avoid copyright infringement with a cover. Look, this is what you're taught in law school, right? In the real world, I don't know that this is the way it works necessarily, but what you're taught is the to avoid copyright infringement, your cover has to be close to the original. In other words, and a very easy
Lyrically, yes.
example is you can't do a country version of a hip hop song, then you might get in trouble. But it's odd that trying to imitate something keeps you out of copyright infringement in that regard. But like you're suggesting, in another way, like with interpolation, you can get in trouble for making it sound too much like something. So it is bizarre. But KJ Green suggested we should have mechanical royalties for samples too. It
I
should just
agree
be
with
out of
that.
the hands of the artist. Yeah.
I 1000% agree with that. There's a great article that Dan Charnas wrote in Slate last month. Dan Charnas is a great author. He's got a hip hop book called the Big, I think it's called The Big Payback, James Brown reference right there, the history of hip hop. But then his most recent book's about Dilla. It came out last year, and
Mm.
I'm halfway through it. He's a wonderful writer, and the history is fascinating about Jay Dilla. And I've been listening to him on some podcasts recently because breaking news. We heard it first on this podcast. I'm about to delve into writing a book. I just signed
Yay.
a book deal,
Awesome.
and
Congratulations.
thank you. And so part of right now what I'm working out in real time through these half formed sentences is what the book will have as a through line through it. It is definitely going to be a book about the many types of creative borrowing. If you've liked the videos, you will like the book. They have a
Right.
lot of things in common. And one thing that I think isn't necessarily required, but I'd love to have a thesis statement for the book.
Mhm.
And I think part of it is going to be similar to what you just alluded to, that there ought to be a mechanism that's much simpler for this type of borrowing that for too long has been relegated. For I think there's a lot of issues that are related to power, a lot of
Mhm.
issues related to race.
Yes.
The article I just alluded to with Charnas, he talks about how we have this framing, I think, since the late 80s and early 90s when those first hip hop lawsuits came out. We have this cultural framing that hip hop, that type of borrowing, we use the word theft. And if you
Mm.
step back and think about what is being stolen, what is being taken, does
Right.
the person do they not have it anymore? Is it
Mhm.
like my bicycle? If you take my bicycle, I do not have my bicycle anymore. But if you, as Public Enemy, if you take something from a James Brown recording, are you adding more than you're taking? I would argue absolutely, because suddenly that James Brown recording is part of a musical conversation. And this goes back to the Jamaica thing. The wonderful thing about Jamaican music is that we're
Yeah.
40, 50 years into a musical conversation where you have rhythms from 1969 that still show up today, not because of laziness. The idea of theft
Mhm.
and laziness are the things that are, to me, lazy ideas that we throw at hip hop for, I think, a lot of racist reasons. But
Mhm.
if you think about it contextually as being, no, 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 this was a choice I made to refer to James Brown, to use this beat, because the history of hip
Right.
hop with Cool Herc starts with using James Brown samples, excuse me, James Brown records. Um, so if we start to think about a different framework for how we think about the type of borrowing that happens with the reuse of musical ideas, and does it really take something from the original person, or are they actually benefiting from it with the renewed context, another way to be heard, the renewed exposure, all the
Right.
things that we know to be the benefits of having your song sampled beyond the monetary? And by the way, there's the monetary.
Yeah, and KJ Green does a lot of he's done a lot of writing and talking about the racist components of trademark law. Yeah.
100%.
Now, yeah, and the goal generally of intellectual property law is what at least what they again what they say, not necessarily in effect, is this balancing of giving the person who's the first to market with something an opportunity to cash in, but not so much that it stifles creativity, and affects culture in the long
Yes.
term. But to your point, you think about like Disney, they've had power enough to change trademark law for years now. They're never giving up Mickey. It seems like there's going to
Well,
be no
next
end
year,
to this
right? Isn't it next year?
unless something changes. And
Right.
it could be possible.
I wouldn't count them out changing, because it is scheduled to happen next year, and there's no way that's going to happen, is there?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Um, so it's interesting to me. this whole conversation about the work that you do online and the work that you're hoping to then bring over to your book. And maybe this is you set it up this way purposefully and consciously that you're filling in that gap that you suggested we had in the 80s where you could learn about music while hearing music and it didn't require the audio file to do much legwork. Whereas today, we don't have that, but you've taken advantage of a medium that, certainly younger generations, and getting older now, can use to get the education that you talk about maybe we lack.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's a very astute connection. I think, yeah, I mean, the one foot in front of the other thing really defines everything about me, from the macro to the micro. Like when I'm sitting down to write a song, like you hear about Mozart and these sort of like geniuses who are like, they had a vision. And when they
Mhm.
went to the paper, all they had to do was transcribe what was already in their head. I do not have that gene. My music, everything I've ever made,
Yeah.
whether it's a video or a song or a remix, it's just like, okay, this sounds good. Now I'm going to do this. It's really just one thing and then the next thing. And then I'm like, I think we're good. I think this is done. So there isn't a grand plan behind it other than what my subconscious is maybe trying to fill in the gaps. You're right. It's
Yeah.
very possible that that's where a lot of this is coming from.